Okay, so I think we're ready to begin. Welcome, everybody. This is Tony Mold with the AOE team again. And we have today a great presentation with Kimberly Carley and Kathy Spanier about virtual strategy planning sessions. Before we continue, we start with the presentation. Just remember that, you can ask questions using the chat box. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, you can type and let us know. We'll try to help you. And also, you can also use the settings here to move from computer audio to phone call. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to have access to it later. And before we continue, I'd like to say a couple of words about our presenters today, Kathy Spanier and Kimberly Carley. Kathy Spanier has more than 40 years of marketing experience, and both in the consulting and client side of the business, and working with a variety of organizations across a number of industries. She currently serves AOE as a strategic planning consultant. And of course, Kimberly Carley, our president, is, we know that she has been leading our team for a couple of years. She has more than 2,000 articles written, and she's the co-author of Leading with Marketing. And she was also the first person in Ohio to earn the certified professional services marketer designation in 1999. So welcome, Kimberly and Kathy.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
Okay, so hopefully folks can see my screen now, and obviously jump into the chat group if for some reason you can't hear me, but I'm gonna go ahead and dive in. Thank you guys for joining today. We know you all have webinar fatigue, but we continue to still get questions related to all sorts of marketing activities right now, especially during the pandemic, which is why we're offering these webinars, these 20-minute short, get in, get out, get on with your lunch. And we can still hit some high topics here. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into strategy and just share a little bit about the word. It traces its roots to military concepts, and it also has roots related to the word lead. And I think that's really important because when we talk about strategy, we're really looking at a leadership type of conversation. So strategic planning in a virtual world. Strategic planning in the best of times usually makes us all groan and roll our eyes. You may be able to attest to that, even if you are one of the folks that really enjoy strategic planning, and hopefully whether you enjoy it or not, you see the benefit of it. It is a lot of work, and it's a lot of work when we're meeting virtually and we are meeting in person and are able to actually sit in a room and plan and do things in the way that we know it. But obviously, we've had to shift and pivot, and that's one of the things that we want to cover here. So strategic planning is a process used to formulate an organization's strategy. The goal here is to create the goals, the tactics, the objectives that help drive your organization. And one of the touch points I'll hit at the very end, but I'll hit it now here too, is I think it's really important. Strategy defines what you do just as much as it defines what you don't do. So that could be a really important thing that you need to make sure that you tackle, especially during these times right now. So flashback to March, which seems like eons ago, it may feel that way for you too. We had 2 strategic planning sessions scheduled. I've been doing strategic planning for about 20 years. Kathy has more experience than that. We were working together, helping some clients get organized related to some sessions. We had the in-person sessions planned. Groundwork was complete. That included stakeholder surveys, both online, all sorts of phone interviews, market research, all those touch points that you need and all that data you need gathered before you actually sit down in person. And then of course we know COVID-19 hit, and the responsible decision was to go ahead and postpone those meetings. Now, why not just go virtual? We actually had that discussion. Should we go virtual? And at the time, it was no, too hard, or, you know, two of the groups we were working with were associations, and we heard from their executive director, no, a lot of my board members just aren't tech savvy, or they really don't, you know, use virtual tools, not sure how we could do it. So at that time, if you remember back to March, we didn't really know how long that we were all going to be working from home. We still don't know in many cases. So we decided to just postpone the sessions. As we moved on to April, it became apparent that our new normal was going to be working from home for a long time, whatever long may mean. And an interesting paradigm shift happened. In a very short time frame, those involved with the planning sessions, those that had been invited and we were planning on meeting in person, had become very comfortable with virtual tools. So those we were working with our clients that said, oh no, we can't do it virtually. You know, Johnny just does not like virtual things. He does not know how to use his computer. They had all become very, very savvy. And then the impact of the pandemic really became a rallying cry as well. For one of the associations we work with, most of their revenue comes from events. They couldn't hold events. So moving forward with the strategic planning session was actually crucial to figure out the direction that they needed to go. So what do we do? How do we go from there? Obviously, it's kind of be careful what you wish for. Kathy and I and our clients, we spent some time saying, yeah, we think we need to pull the trigger and move ahead. And I will share that one of our clients decided not to, and for good reason. It's not necessarily you need to push ahead for everybody. But for those that did decide to move ahead, there were a lot of lessons learned. And that's what we want to share with you today, because it was clunky and we did learn a lot. So first item here was simply pre-work and homework. And this is where I'm going to have a conversation with you, Kathy. And Kathy, unfortunately, I can't see you. My videos of people actually disappeared. So I'm going to have you jump in here. But we spent a lot of time being very diligent about identifying what information needed to get to the attendees of the session beforehand and what we would actually cover in person. One of the ideas that we had afterwards that we hope to use next time, I wish we would have thought of it, is maybe the use of video. So for example, you know, one of the things that we did share in the virtual planning session was all that survey data that I mentioned, those phone surveys, those one-on-one interviews, the online surveys. And we sent the information beforehand as we felt it would be really important for the group to have it, and then we did a high-level overview of it with the group, but you know, didn't go into as much detail as maybe we would have if we had a day-long session that we were doing sitting next to each other. But in hindsight, we could have done a video that actually showcased some of that information. So Kathy, I'm going to jump over to you here. What else can you share about our process as we looked at what needed to happen as we were planning and shifting these meetings from in-person sessions to virtual sessions?
Sure. I think it was a aha moment, because being able to go and do this session live is having that face-to-face contact and interaction. How do I get to know these individuals? So that was something that we had to overcome, and we were able to get some background, know that we had the right audience when we were doing this planning. I think it took a lot of extra work to sift through all the information that if we were going to do it in a day, had to distill it down to hours at that point. So though, I mean, from my standpoint, I think it worked well, but there was a lot of planning, a lot of communication going on, and being respectful of people's time. And to your point, Kimberly, the virtual was the only way to go. And I think the other plus was the fact that they wanted to continue to move ahead because things were shifting on the outside. Everybody was being affected by COVID-19. And so having that energy moving into this was a real positive thing, and you could feel it.
Fantastic, yep. So we'll keep moving and we'll continue this dialogue. As Kathy mentioned, instead of a day, we quickly opted and decided that we needed to actually break these sessions out into shorter segments. Number one, we all have webinar fatigue. We have online meeting fatigue. Those of you on this session probably nodding your head. And so we recognize the importance of finding a way to, capture attendance and do it in a smaller fashion. So we opted for three 90-minute sessions instead of the day-long session that we may typically have on an in-person session. And that took longer, and we had to be very deliberate in terms of what we were going to handle at each session, what it looked like in between each session. But we felt that was the best and most responsible way to have it. And we actually had a week-long or 2-week-long break in between the sessions as well, with a little bit of homework on that. I'm going to move on to the next one and get some feedback from Kathy on this one as well. Planning an icebreaker and touch point. So this is something that we would do if we were in person. Especially, an in-person session, a lot of the sessions that I'll do for an association, for example, maybe everybody flies in the night before, there's a dinner, there's a chance to be casual and share what's going on in each other's firms, talk, chat, whether you know each other or not, and help set the tone for that introduction. Doing it in a virtual setting, Kathy and I actually didn't know the participants, minus a couple of them. So that was a disadvantage for us in the beginning. Fortunately, the group knew each other, but we still felt there was a need and an importance for interaction. Kathy, what else can you add to this in terms of tips? Because it was so important to set the tone of the group here.
Right, and I think that the biggest topic that we covered was how people were feeling today, and kind of getting a feel for the group and engaging in this. And I think that everybody's business is challenged. I think the other thing that we were addressing that I thought was quite remarkable is that we were challenging their mission. And so being able to get some sense as to where they were coming from, if they were safe, if there was a lot of anxiety in their life, or if they really were addressing this and being able to handle the situation. So I think the introductions, to Kimberly's point, I didn't know anybody. We did some pre-planning, but being able to have that conversation with them and listening to them, so that you could have that base moving into the strategic session.
Great points, and I'll share another caveat with that though. With introductions, be very careful. I sat in on a round table in May. I was a presenter, and the organizer wanted to do just that, take a pulse of the group in terms of how are you guys feeling, what's business like for you, and those that were participating in the round table didn't know each other. So he wanted to create that interaction, well-intended, but for the 90-minute roundtable, those introductions ended up taking about 45 minutes, which cut into the presentation and the discussion. Now, those introductions were actually really good. It helped set the tone and help people understand that they were all in this together in one way and share ideas. But it did change the focus of the roundtable. So keeping that in mind too, in terms of an icebreaker or how you break things out.
One thing, Kimberly, going back to the other side, breaking the sessions up. I think what was really good, you think about having that day-long session and you have a lot of interaction with the group, the meeting after the meeting or meeting during the break. So, we didn't have that. So by breaking them up into sections, we gave people time to think through what we had just gone through, have a feedback loop, and then give us feedback before we entered into the next session.
Good point. And that actually did happen. And in some cases, we almost had to recalibrate because, as you can imagine, 90-minute sessions, we throw a lot at people. They go off and discuss, which is what we want them to do. And then by next week, we almost had to corral everybody back again and get on the same page. So that's a nice segue in terms of establishing ground rules. Kathy and I talked about in the beginning, no different than you'd set ground rules if you were doing some strategy session in person, we felt it was really, really crucial to do it in terms of doing this in an online environment. We had a discussion and decided we were going to ask everybody to keep their cameras on, whether they liked it or not. We asked them to, because we know that it's so easy to disengage if you don't have your camera on. I found it interesting, even though people knew we were watching them, some people still would feel free to do their own thing. But it did, I think, keep people a little bit more focused. And then Kathy and I would tag team it. So for example, when she was speaking about the survey results, my role was to really look at everybody on camera. How are they doing? Are they engaging? What's their facial reaction? So since we weren't sitting around the table, I had to do that. And then Kathy did the same when I was talking in terms of making sure that we were looking at that. So making sure you have very clear roles in terms of who is actually handling things. The mistake I made in one of the first sessions is I was trying to take notes at the same time I was leading while on camera. Doesn't work. Make sure you have somebody to do that. What else can you add to that, Kathy? Any other lessons learned in terms of our ground rules and the interaction?
Yeah, I think the most important one for me, because I think that we did a really good job of having people have their video on, was the facilitation. And that we didn't have hard handoffs, we didn't have it canned presentation. We wanted to make it conversational. And we knew enough, we had enough meetings and kind of practices before that we understood each other and we had a good flow. So easily I could pass it off to somebody else, or pass it off to me. We kind of understood each other's kind of area. And so I think that made the flow go well. And I think that's what's difficult about doing things virtually. It's either, you know, I don't know how many webinars I've been involved in and it show up and you just get a lot of information. So there's no engagement. So I think having good facilitation, back to the point, Kimberly, that somebody can be watching the body language and doing check-ins when that person is presenting or facilitating the conversation. So.
Good points, really good points. So encouraging participation, Kathy, that's another example, a good segue for you. You always tee it up really well for me. We talked about the importance of having some touch points designed in to the presentation. And that's, you know, a little risky too, because if you've taken several hours down to 90 minutes and then you're going to open something up for discussion, how are you going to be able to control it? Are you going to use the raise the hand feature, whatever? You don't want to stifle conversation. So we designed a couple of touch points related to sharing opinions. And one of the things, and this came out of our ground rules, is we wanted to give people an opportunity to pass as well. Because what we didn't want, and I'll back up, we actually decided to have like a round robin. So if we had 12 people, you know, Kathy would present something and then my role was actually to just call on every single person, go around the Brady Bunch square here and say, what do you think, what do you think? But we wanted to give people a chance to pass if they didn't have anything substantial to add that was different. Because otherwise it just becomes a regurgitation, like Joe said, like Mary said. Other lessons learned, Kathy, from that experience for us for encouraging participation? I will say that I was surprised we had less participation than I would have guessed. And I think that's just webinar fatigue. Yeah. Right.
And I think it worked really well to your point by telling them if you have nothing to add, just say pass. Going into this though, we were understanding that this group was very vocal. So to your point, they were very respectful. I don't think people felt, I think they felt they were all heard. So I don't think that you know, inhibited them from participating at all because it was virtual. I think we got some good quality out of it.
So in terms of lessons learned here, were these sessions a success? I will say that they were, but they took a lot more energy than normal, not only from the planning process, but even the administration part of it. I mean, both Kathy and I afterwards like, wow, that was exhausting, even though it went well. They were a little clunkier. And another big takeaway is it took longer for the participants to absorb the material. I've thought long and hard about it. Kathy and I have talked about it. We can't really put our fingers on why that is. Maybe it's just because we're not in person. You know, we have to consider different learning styles too, which is why it's so important to make sure that you give handouts or give information ahead of time for those that actually need to sit and look and write or whatever, you know, whatever, if they're visual or auditory learner. Kathy, jump in here. What else is a lesson learned for you and tips for our group listening today?
I think back to the point that it takes participants longer to absorb the material. Even though you give them information before, I think the virtual environment is really hard, and there are so many distractions for people. We were working with a volunteer group, so it wasn't like that's their job. They had responsibility to the organization or association. So I think that made it even harder, but we did, I think for the most part, you have to call it successful, because in the end, we were able to accomplish getting them focused based on the changes that were taking place and eliminate things that they needed to recalibrate their resources, their time, their money,
yeah.
and the volunteer membership. So.
Really good points. So in terms of next steps, as a way to finalize this, and then we will open it up to questions. The one thing that I would encourage you to ask yourself, you know, we can't afford to plan right now. We're too busy. We don't know which way is up. We're still trying to find our way through the pandemic. But ask yourself, can you afford not to do some sort of planning right now? You know, looking at the session, or looking at your existing plans, do you need to dust them off? Where should your focus be? And then I'll come back to a point I made in the very beginning, is that strategy is not just outlining what you're going to do, but gives you some definition in terms of what are you going to not do. It serves as a decision tree. And I like to ask my team, and it's something that I commonly ask with clients I work to, is what needs to come off the list? We've added a bunch of things to the list. What can we stop doing? You know, and there's many things. Maybe you'd answer that question a lot differently in February, and now where you are, you've proven otherwise. Other lessons learned, Kathy, that you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think for me, this makes strategy more important because of what's going on today. And the word agility comes into play. So strategy, I think we learned from this organization, was something that was done and put on a shelf, where a strategy and a lot of companies are doing today is always having a pulse on what's going on internally and externally. Who hasn't been affected the last 3 months? So how do we adjust? How do we have the processes in place to continually adapt? And strategy does that for you. We all know that strategy aligns with, is giving us a direction to accomplish our missions. So our mission statement. So I think from that standpoint, I think strategy is becoming a more important part, and it's how you continually adapt and keep checking. Being able to measure something, and if it's not doing the right thing, especially in an environment like now, you have to be able to be willing to take some small risks. I think that we're in uncharted times. And so that's why strategy isn't going to be hard and fast. It's going to be taking some risks and making that adjustment, but measuring it to know that it's effective or not effective. That's what strategy should be able to do for you.
Fantastic. And that's a really nice way to end our presentation at this point. Like to open it up to questions. Tony, if any questions have come in, happy to entertain them now.
Sure. Thank you for this great presentation. We have a question here. What is the optimal number of people to have in a virtual strategic planning session?
Great question. And Kathy and I spent a lot of time talking about this one. We believe the right answer is, 8 to 10. We were in a situation with the one session that we did for an association that 12 people had already been invited, and that's just the way it was. We could not invite anybody. And we were actually hoping somebody would have a conflict, but didn't prove to be the case. We ended up having 13 of us on the phone or on the video conference. But any research shows, if you look at association research, anything over 7 people, you end up getting groupthink and decision-making changes. People will take a pass, they'll sit out, and it'll be interesting to see, if that study is updated at all regards to the virtual world. Great book, Race for Relevance, talks quite a bit about that. Kathy, thoughts from you in terms of the optimal size as well?
And I think along with the optimal size, I agree with you with the number, making sure you have good representation from all the sectors that you're serving. So you want to have a good influx. You don't want to have it weighted inequitably.
Yeah, good point. Great point. Tony, do we have any other questions?
Sure, we have another question here. How do you determine what materials the group should get and digest before the strategy session? And what should be presented during the session?
Great question, and really hard to answer that one. Kathy, do you want to jump in on that one?
I think what we did is we had a person that kind of oversees the association that we deferred to a little bit, but I think it was our position to make sure that we represented the information that was relevant to what we knew we were going to address and was consistent across the membership. So we had to take a lot of stuff out. I mean, I believe we had 75 questions on it, which is amazing to me that we had the participation in an online survey and the one-on-one surveys. And I did the one-on-one surveys, and everybody showed up for the interview. So we had the energy there from the membership, and I feel that we had enough consistent themes that we distilled those themes to make sure that they were heard and we could take action on that from a strategic standpoint.
I'll add to that we asked the question, what could they learn or what could they possibly absorb that doesn't have to be done with us as a group? So looking at the survey results was part of it. We wanted to make sure we pulled out some key points, but we said, does this information have to be delivered? And then instead of just taking the agenda that we had for the in-person meeting and just breaking it out into chunks, we looked at it and said, okay, we felt the optimal time was 90 minutes. What is our goal to get to the end of this 90-minute segment? And then what is it that we hope that they're going to discover or think about, or the homework we're going to give them before the next session? So it was really breaking things out into kind of more building blocks that I think we would do in a in-person session. And that may be a lesson learned for in-person sessions too. Like, how do we structure and organize things a little better so it just doesn't seem like a long day going from topic to topic? How do we bridge the gap in between those things? So long-winded answer. It's a great question, but it's tough. Really ask yourself. And again, I'd love for somebody to play with that video idea of, going over the survey results in a video first. Kathy, you look like you're going to say, add something.
And I think we had 90 minutes. 20 minutes was all that I spent sharing the recap. So really, when you think of, if we were to do that in person, to your point, we would have had an hour discussion. Well, we would have had maybe because we were live. So I think it is being respectful of time and being able to distill things to the point where it was reasonable. Any other questions, Tony?
No, we don't have any more questions. And unless you have any additional comments to make?
Just encourage all of you that are listening to look at your plans. I think it's probably more important than ever, as Kathy pointed out, because we all need to be very agile, and we've learned that. And encourage you to reach out. I'm happy to talk to anybody free of charge and just give you some advice. Kathy would be as well, in terms of how to get your hands around this, because it's really key and important. And also, if you dive into a strategic planning session, share with us what you've learned. Because we're in uncharted territories in terms of this. So we want to learn from you as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, and then unless we have something else to say, we'd like to remind our participants that they can take a brief survey after we exit. Please also remember that you can find this presentation and other presentations that we have done in the past at the very simple web address, aoeteamwebinars.com, aoeteamwebinars.com, very easy to remember. And, thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Kathy. Thanks to all our participants, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.